The night cracked open with a headline glowing across every phone screen, its letters sharp like blades cutting through Daniel's chest as he read the words that declared his downfall. Daniel whispered, "This can't be real. This can't be happening," his trembling fingers scrolling through endless hashtags screaming his name. Crowds gathered outside his office, faces twisted in rage, their chants echoing like drums of war beating against his heart. Daniel said, "They loved me yesterday, and today they spit fire like I'm a monster." Reporters shoved microphones, shouting accusations, while cameras captured every drop of sweat glistening on his skin like proof of guilt. In his own home, the television replayed the clip of his speech, twisted out of context, his smile frozen into something sinister. Daniel whispered, "One mistake, or one lie, and everything I built turns into ash." The air felt heavier, every ring of his phone another betrayal, sponsors fleeing, friends ghosting, family slipping into silence. Daniel shouted, "Who's behind this? Who wants me burned alive in the public square?" The sound of his voice was drowned by the roar of the mob outside, a tidal wave of outrage that promised no mercy. Daniel sat at his desk, the silence heavier than the protests outside, his mind replaying the same question over and over. Daniel whispered, "How do I explain the truth when no one cares to hear it?" The walls felt closer, pictures of smiling voters staring down from his shelves, mocking him with memories of applause. Daniel said, "They raised me up so high, only to enjoy the spectacle of watching me fall." Every notification on his phone dragged his heart lower, strangers celebrating his destruction like a sport. Daniel whispered, "Where is anyone who once called me friend?" His chest tightened, his hands pressed against the desk, the weight of betrayal pressing harder than steel chains. Daniel said, "This silence hurts more than their shouting." The echo of his own voice filled the empty room, sounding smaller with every repetition. Daniel stared at the floor, the shame staining him like ink that could never be scrubbed away. Daniel stood before the bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a man he no longer recognized. Daniel whispered, "Is this what they see? A villain painted from fragments of half-truths?" The fluorescent light flickered above him, harsh and unforgiving, exaggerating every wrinkle, every flaw. Daniel said, "They won't forgive, they won't forget, they don't even want the truth." His hands gripped the sink, knuckles white, his breath shallow, as if the air itself rejected him. Daniel whispered, "I used to believe in ideals, in change, in hope." The sound of distant chanting seeped in through the walls, a reminder that escape was impossible. Daniel said, "Now all I hear is their hunger for blood." The mirror seemed to warp, his reflection distorted by the fog of his own trembling breath. Daniel whispered, "I wonder if I can survive their hatred." Daniel scrolled through messages on his phone, hundreds of texts flashing like bullets, each one sharper than the last. Daniel said, "Coward, liar, fraud," reading the words aloud as if punishment required repetition. His fingers hesitated over one message from his son, unread, the weight of silence heavier than every insult combined. Daniel whispered, "He won't even answer me anymore." The phone buzzed again, another notification, another stranger's delight at his ruin. Daniel said, "This is not justice, this is sport." The sound of laughter outside seeped through the window, more haunting than any chant. Daniel whispered, "Why does betrayal feel so quiet?" His shoulders slumped as he set the phone down, unable to look at it any longer. Daniel said, "Even in my own house, I am surrounded by their voices." Daniel sat in his armchair, staring at the fireplace that no longer held a flame, only ashes of what once burned brightly. Daniel whispered, "Everything I built is nothing but dust now." The quiet creaked louder than screams, as though the house itself had abandoned him. Daniel said, "They've taken my career, my voice, and now even the warmth of home." The clock ticked, every second mocking him, measuring the distance between who he was and who he had become. Daniel whispered, "I can't find myself in this silence." Shadows crawled up the walls like memories refusing to die. Daniel said, "Was this their goal? To erase me until nothing remains? His chest rose and fell as if the air fought him with every breath. Daniel whispered, "Perhaps tomorrow there will be no one left to remember my name." Daniel sat in his study, sunlight spilling across stacks of books, their spines reminders of speeches once filled with hope. Daniel whispered, "I thought ideals could survive storms, but ideals drown faster than men." On the wall, framed photos of campaign rallies gleamed, smiling crowds frozen in devotion that now felt like mockery. Daniel said they cheered, they believed, and now they vanish as if belief was never real. His hand brushed over a dusty award, the plaque cold, his name engraved like a relic from another life. Daniel whispered, "I once thought history would remember me as a builder." The silence answered, reminding him that history only remembered the fallen. Daniel said, "I cannot understand how quickly admiration turns to venom." The study felt smaller, the air thick with ghosts of promises broken by others' hands. Daniel whispered, "Maybe they never knew me at all." Daniel walked down the hallway lined with family portraits, each frame filled with smiles from better days. Daniel whispered, "They once called me father, husband, leader, and now they call me silence." His hand lingered on a picture of his son Michael, the boy's teenage grin holding innocence that distance had stolen. Daniel said, "Michael won't return my calls. His silence speaks louder than any insult." The air pressed cold against his skin, as though the house itself rejected him. Daniel whispered, "Home is supposed to heal, not wound." Shadows stretched long on the walls, his figure broken across them, fractured like his spirit. Daniel said, "Perhaps I gave them reasons to hide. Perhaps my shame is theirs now." The portraits seemed to stare at him with quiet judgment, captured faces alive with silent accusation. Daniel whispered, "I never thought my own house would feel like exile." Daniel sat across from Emily in a quiet cafe, her hands folded tightly, eyes filled with worry. Emily said, "I still believe you, but they'll destroy me if I stand beside you." Daniel whispered, "Then let them destroy us both, because truth needs more than silence." Emily shook her head, her voice low, as though the walls themselves could betray her. Emily said, "I've lost friends already for defending you. They don't forgive loyalty." Daniel whispered, "Then loyalty is the last virtue we have left." The hum of chatter around them felt sharp, each whisper a dagger aimed at their table. Emily said, "I will not abandon you, even if it costs me everything." Daniel's eyes softened, relief clashing with guilt at dragging her into the fire. Daniel whispered, "You're the only voice that hasn't gone quiet." Daniel visited the office of Mark, once his closest ally, now distant with a polished smile hiding sharp edges. Mark said, "I wish I could help, but standing with you means falling with you." Daniel whispered, "So you rise on the ashes of my ruin?" Mark leaned back, his eyes calculating, words dripping with feigned regret. Mark said, "It's not personal, it's survival, and you taught us all to survive politics." Daniel whispered, "I taught you loyalty, but loyalty is the first casualty of fear." The office walls glowed with ambition, awards and flags staged for power. Daniel said, "I thought friendship could outlast scandal." Mark offered only silence, his silence louder than betrayal. Daniel whispered, "Even betrayal dresses itself as wisdom." Daniel wandered through the park where he once spoke to cheering crowds, benches now empty, the stage abandoned. Daniel whispered, "I once promised hope here, and now hope hides from me." Children played in the distance, their laughter sharp against his heavy silence. Daniel said, "I used to stand tall, thinking my words could build futures." Leaves rustled across the ground, whispering like forgotten applause. Daniel whispered, "Now my words are poison in their ears." The empty stage loomed ahead, the wood-weathered echoes of speeches lingering like ghosts. Daniel said, "I gave them dreams, and they gave me exile." The wind pressed against his coat, carrying the chill of a forgotten leader. Daniel whispered, "Perhaps truth was never enough to protect me." Daniel stood in front of his television, the screen flashing with breaking news banners, each headline more vicious than the last. Daniel whispered, They speak of me like I'm a criminal, when all I did was try to lead with ideals. The anchor's voice dripped with mock certainty, dissecting his past with the glee of a predator circling wounded prey. Daniel said, "Every word they twist becomes another stone hurled at my chest." His fists clenched, nails cutting into skin, yet the pain felt cleaner than the lies. Daniel whispered, "Truth has no weight in a world fed by outrage." Clips of old speeches replayed, edited into new meanings that distorted his intentions. Daniel said, "I don't recognize the man they've created out of me." The room buzzed with static shadows flickering across the walls, each one whispering betrayal. Daniel whispered, "I fear even my silence now fuels their fire." Daniel sat across from Emily at her apartment, her eyes red from sleepless nights, worry etched deep. Emily said, "They're calling me a traitor for standing with you." Daniel whispered, "Then they'll brand me a monster for letting you." Her hand reached across the table, trembling but firm, a silent promise in a world of noise. Emily said, "I've lost contracts, friends, and maybe my career, but I will not lose myself by abandoning you." Daniel whispered, "Your loyalty is heavier than chains, yet it saves me from drowning." The faint hum of city traffic outside bled through the silence, distant yet unignorable. Emily said, "We cannot outrun the storm, so we must endure it." Daniel's eyes softened, gratitude carving deep lines of both love and guilt. Daniel whispered, "Your voice keeps me breathing when theirs want me buried." Daniel checked his inbox, his stomach sinking as sponsor after sponsor pulled out, their words dressed in polite betrayal. Daniel whispered, "We regret to inform you." Those words ring louder than any chant outside. Screens filled with contract terminations, each one cutting deeper, a silent parade of abandonment. Daniel said, "They never believed in me, only in what I could sell." His chair creaked as he leaned back, exhaustion dragging him into the shadows. Daniel whispered, "I built bridges with my words, and they burned them with their signatures." Notifications kept pinging, the cruel rhythm of loss. Daniel said, even silence would feel kinder than their hollow apologies. The glow of the screen painted his face pale, each reflection a ghost of ambition lost. Daniel whispered, "I am no longer their leader, only their liability." Daniel walked into his party headquarters, the once bustling space now eerily quiet, staff desks abandoned. Daniel whispered, "This place once roared with life, and now it's a graveyard of ambition." A lone assistant glanced up, her eyes filled with pity before quickly looking away. Daniel said, "Even pity feels heavier than hate." The posters of his campaign still hung proudly, but dust dulled their colors, slogans now hollow echoes. Daniel whispered, "The same walls that carried cheers now carry silence sharper than knives." Mark appeared in the doorway, his face expressionless, his silence a statement louder than words. Daniel said, "You will not even speak to me, though I once called you brother." Mark turned away, walking into the corridor of shadows without response. Daniel whispered, "Betrayal needs no words, silence is enough." Daniel sat on a park bench at twilight, hood pulled over his head, listening to strangers gossip nearby. Stranger one said, "Did you hear? He's finished. Couldn't happen to a more deserving man." Stranger two said, "He fooled us all, and now the truth shows." Daniel whispered, "Even strangers carry daggers with their tongues." He turned his gaze to the playground, children laughing freely, unaware of the cruelty that shaped their parents' words. Daniel said, "I once promised a future for them, now they inherit my disgrace." Leaves scattered at his feet, wind whispering like judgment carried through the air. Daniel whispered, "Outrage is their entertainment, my pain their sport." The gossipers laughed, walking away, leaving him in the silence of twilight. Daniel said, "Perhaps obscurity is the only mercy left for me." Daniel sat in the archives room of City Hall, dusty files spread across the table like forgotten truths waiting to breathe again. Daniel whispered, "If they want my past exposed, let me search for theirs." His eyes scanned through records of campaign donations, and a pattern emerged like rot beneath polished wood. Daniel said, "They called me corrupt. but their hands are darker than mine. The fluorescent light hummed above, buzzing like a warning of secrets about to escape. Daniel whispered, "Mark's signature." Again and again, money buried in false names. Sweat dotted his forehead as he pieced together the betrayal written in ink. Daniel said, "It wasn't outrage that killed me, it was design." The silence of the room carried a weight heavier than thunder, history itself leaning closer. Daniel whispered, "The mob was just the weapon, but the betrayer sharpened the blade." Daniel confronted Emily with the evidence, his hands shaking as he laid the papers before her. Daniel whispered, "It was never the mob. It was Mark who fed them lies." Emily leaned closer, her eyes widening with the shock of betrayal. Emily said, "He destroyed you to rise higher, to silence your voice so his could be louder." Daniel whispered, "And I defended him once as a brother." Emily's hand trembled as she touched the documents, as if the truth itself burned. Emily said, "This changes everything, but it may already be too late." Daniel whispered, "No truth comes late, it only arrives when it must." Her eyes filled with both fear and determination, the weight of choice pressing down on her. Emily said, "Then we must decide if the world deserves to hear this truth." Daniel stood in the hallway outside Mark's office, the papers clutched in his hand like a weapon forged from betrayal. Daniel whispered, "You stole my life to build your throne." Mark emerged, his polished smile cracking when he saw what Daniel carried. Mark said, "You don't understand the game. You were too pure for survival." Daniel whispered, "You fed them blood, knowing they would drink until I drowned." Mark's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp with cruelty masked as reason. Mark said, "I didn't betray you, I simply refused to sink with you." Daniel whispered, "Then you drowned me to make sure the waters carried only my body." Their silence stretched like a battlefield, the truth heavy between them. Daniel said, "The mob was never my enemy, it was you." Daniel returned to Emily, his breath uneven, his body trembling from the confrontation. Daniel whispered, "He didn't even deny it. Betrayal lives proudly in his smile." Emily clenched her fists, her voice heavy with anger. Emily said, "Then we must show them. Let the world see who holds the knife." Daniel whispered, "The mob won't care, they only want blood, not justice." Emily's eyes burned with defiance, refusing to surrender. Emily said, "Then let us give them blood, but not yours." Daniel whispered, "Do you believe they'll listen, or will truth die like I already have?" Emily leaned forward, gripping his hand, her voice steady. Emily said, "They may not listen, but history will, and history is louder than mobs." Daniel sat before his recorder, the papers spread beside him, his voice heavy as he prepared to speak the truth into existence. Daniel whispered, "They will hate me no less, but they will know." The red light blinked, every pulse like the beat of his unraveling heart. Daniel said, "Mark betrayed me, and the outrage you fed was his feast." His voice cracked but carried, words flowing like blood spilled willingly for justice. Daniel whispered, "If this is my last speech, let it be the truth they tried to bury." The walls absorbed his confession, a witness to history's correction. Daniel said, "Outrage may silence me, but it cannot silence evidence." He leaned closer, his tone sharp with defiance even in despair. Daniel whispered, "If I fall, let the truth crush the throne built on lies." Daniel stepped onto the stage at a press conference, the room suffocating with cameras aimed like rifles at his chest. Daniel whispered, "If this is the end, then let it be in my own words." Flashes lit his face, each one capturing a moment of ruin, each frame a scar on his history. Daniel said, "I was betrayed by those closest to me, not by the strangers who chant outside." Murmurs surged, reporters scribbling furiously, hungry for blood. Daniel whispered, "Mark built his power on my destruction, and the mob carried his torch." The crowd gasped, tension tightening the air like a noose. Daniel said, "I will not beg for mercy, but I will demand truth." His voice trembled, but each word struck like steel on stone. Daniel whispered, "This may be my last stand, but I stand." Mark stepped forward from the crowd, his polished grin cracked into defiance, ready to twist the moment into his victory. Mark said, "You blame me because you could not survive the storm you created." Daniel whispered, "I did not create the storm, you sold it, one whisper at a time." The audience hushed, their silence louder than their questions, waiting for truth to erupt. Mark said, "Survival is not betrayal, it is wisdom." Daniel whispered, "Then wisdom has made you a murderer of character." Their words clashed like swords, the air sharp with accusation. Mark said, "The mob chose me because you were weak." Daniel whispered, "No, they chose you because you fed them lies." The crowd erupted, the press devouring every word like fire consuming dry leaves. Emily rose from the audience, her voice trembling but clear, cutting through the chaos like a bell in fog. Emily said, "I saw the documents. I know the truth Daniel carries is real." Daniel whispered, "You risk everything by speaking here." Emily's eyes burned with fire, her voice stronger with every word. Emily said, "Silence is betrayal, and I refuse to betray him." The cameras swung toward her, their focus turning loyalty into spectacle. Mark said, "You're nothing but a desperate defender clinging to a sinking man." Emily said, "No, I am a voice against your lies." Daniel whispered, "Your courage is the only light in this darkness." The crowd fractured, whispers dividing between doubt and belief. Mark lunged with words, his voice raised, his calm mask shattered by desperation. Mark said, "You think loyalty can erase corruption. He is guilty, and you will drown with him." Daniel whispered, "The guilty always scream loudest when truth is near." The room roared, voices colliding in chaos, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Emily said, "Your fear betrays you, Mark. It shows louder than evidence." Mark's face twisted, veins rising, his hands slamming against the podium. Daniel said, "I may be broken, but I will not be silent." The air burned with rage, shame, and unrelenting defiance. Mark said, "You will be nothing but ashes when this is over." Daniel whispered, "Then let me burn with truth, not with lies." Daniel gripped the microphone, his voice shaking but unbroken, the final crescendo of a life torn apart. Daniel said, "You cannot erase me with hashtags, nor bury me with betrayal." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words pressing like thunder in still air. Daniel whispered, "You made me your villain, but villains still carry truth." Emily placed her hand on his arm, steadying him, her presence an anchor in the storm. Daniel said, "I will not win back your applause, but I will leave you my truth." Mark turned away, face pale, retreating into the shadows of his own exposure. Daniel whispered, "History will remember who lit the fire, not just who burned in it." The silence stretched, unbroken, as if even the mob had lost its voice. Daniel said, "This is my end, but not my silence." Daniel walked out of the press hall into the night, the roar of the crowd fading into a silence that felt heavier than noise. Daniel whispered, "I gave them my truth, yet truth never wins applause." Emily walked beside him, her eyes searching his face for hope he could no longer give. Emily said, "They may not cheer now, but someday they will know." Daniel whispered, "By then I will only be a memory painted in ash." The cold wind pressed against his coat, tugging at him like unseen hands. Daniel said, "I thought defiance would save me, but it only empties me." Emily touched his arm, her voice quiet but firm. Emily said, "It saved your dignity, and that is worth more than applause." Daniel whispered, "Dignity is lonely company." Daniel sat in his living room, the fire rekindled but weak, flames flickering like the remnants of his resolve. Daniel whispered, "I used to sit here proud, believing I had earned my place in history." The television remained dark, his reflection staring back in the black screen. Daniel said, "Now I hide from their voices, their laughter, their judgment." Emily leaned against the doorway, her eyes filled with quiet strength. Emily said, "History will be kinder than the mob." Daniel whispered, "History forgets faster than mobs forgive." The ticking clock filled the silence, every second marking distance from who he once was. Daniel said, Even my own son refuses to answer me. His voice cracked, softer than the fire's hiss. Daniel whispered, "And that silence hurts most of all." Daniel walked through the city streets at dawn. Hood pulled over his head, anonymous among strangers who once cheered his name. Daniel whispered, "Obscurity is my new shield, though it tastes like exile." Billboards still displayed his face, defaced with graffiti, the word liar screaming across his smile. Daniel said, "They will not let me fade quietly. They must carve me into a warning." Passers-by avoided his eyes, some whispering, some spitting insults under their breath. Daniel whispered, "Every stranger's word carries the weight of betrayal." The sky glowed faintly pink, the beauty of dawn cruel against his despair. Daniel said, "The world still spins while mine has collapsed." Shadows stretched long across the cracked pavement, chasing him as if even light refused to follow. Daniel whispered, "I walk among them, but I no longer belong." Daniel sat on a bench outside his son Michael's school, watching from a distance as laughter spilled out with students. Daniel whispered, "He belongs to a world untouched by my ruin." Michael walked out, headphones on, his face hardened by the weight of association. Daniel said, "Michael, I am still your father, even if the world denies me." But Michael kept walking, never turning his head, his silence cutting sharper than shouts. Daniel whispered, "His silence is the loudest verdict." The crowd of teenagers passed around him, barely noticing, their laughter rising like a cruel chorus. Daniel said, "I have lost more than career, more than reputation. I have lost family." His hands tightened together, trembling, empty of comfort. Daniel whispered, "This is the punishment that lingers longest." Daniel returned home, the weight of rejection sinking deep, yet his voice carried a final note of resolve. Daniel whispered, "I cannot reclaim what I've lost, but I will not surrender truth." Emily met him at the door, her eyes tired but filled with unwavering loyalty. Emily said, "You still have me, and sometimes one voice is enough." Daniel whispered, "The world sees me as ruined, but you see me as human." She smiled faintly, holding his hand, her presence a lifeline in the storm. Daniel said, "If history erases me, at least I will not be erased from your heart." The room grew quiet, the fire burning brighter, a fragile warmth returning. Daniel whispered, "I may never rise again, but I will endure." Emily said, "And enduring is its own form of victory." Daniel stood at his balcony overlooking the city at dawn, the skyline painted in fragile gold, indifferent to his ruin. Daniel whispered, "The world wakes while I wither, but still I breathe." Emily joined him, her hand brushing his, silent but grounding. Emily said, "You faced them and you spoke. Whether they listened or not, you did not fall in silence." Daniel whispered, "Silence is death, and I am not ready to die." The city stirred below, horns and footsteps rising like a new chorus. Daniel said, "They may never forgive, but at least I forced them to remember." Emily's eyes softened, a faint smile tracing her lips. Emily said, "You remain human when they tried to make you a monster." Daniel whispered, "Perhaps humanity is my last victory." Daniel walked through a crowded market, blending into anonymity, faces passing without recognition. Daniel whispered, "Obscurity is exile, but it is also freedom." Vendors shouted, children laughed, life moved forward as though his story had never mattered. Daniel said, "The mob forgets as quickly as it destroys." A passerby glanced at him, eyes narrowing, but quickly turned away. Daniel whispered, "Some still remember, but remembering costs them nothing now." The colors of fruit stalls, the clamor of bargaining, reminded him of a world untouched by scandal. Daniel said, "Life does not wait for the fallen, it rushes ahead." He touched an apple, its weight simple, grounding, untainted by outrage. Daniel whispered, "Perhaps simplicity is my redemption." Daniel sat on a bench near a quiet river, its surface glistening with sunset light. Daniel whispered, "Water carries everything away, rage, lies, even names." Emily joined him, her presence calm, watching the river flow. Emily said, "The world has taken much from you, but it has not taken me." Daniel whispered, "Then perhaps I am not as empty as I thought." Birds flew overhead, their wings catching the last rays of sun, unbothered by scandal or shame. Daniel said, "I wonder if truth flows like this river, slow, steady, but unstoppable." Emily leaned against him, her silence warm and certain. Daniel whispered, "I have no stage, no crowd, no power, but I still have breath." The river answered in ripples, carrying his words away. Daniel stood in his study again, the recorder on the desk, its red light blinking, carrying his confession to history. Daniel whispered, "If they bury me, these words will remain." Emily placed her hand on his shoulder, steady, unshaken. Emily said, "Truth has patience, even if people do not." Daniel whispered, "Patience feels cruel when wounds still bleed." He pressed the button, the tape ending with a final click, a sound heavy with permanence. Daniel said, "Let history judge me when the mob has gone silent." The room grew still, his voice lingering like smoke from a dying fire. Emily whispered, "And history will remember." Daniel closed his eyes, breathing as though lighter at last. Daniel sat alone in the dark, the house quiet, his heart heavy but steady. Daniel whispered, "They destroyed my name, but they did not take my voice." He stared into the silence, words forming like a final oath. Daniel said one day, "They will realize outrage was their entertainment, and truth their casualty." The night pressed close, but his eyes burned with defiance. Daniel whispered, "I will fade, but my words will echo." He stood, walking toward the window, the city lights flickering like scattered stars. Daniel said, "My story will not end with silence. It will end with this." He placed his hand against the glass, a single tear tracing his cheek. Daniel whispered, "The final blow is mine.